It is my pleasure to introduce our today's speaker for the Kempner 57 series, Dr. Shari Liu. Dr. Liu is an assistant professor in the psychological and brain sciences at Johns Hopkins University, where she investigates the developmental origin of intelligence, exploring how infants and young children come to understand the physical and social worlds around them. Dr. Liu earned her PhD in psychology at Harvard University in 2020, working with Elizabeth Spelke. Her dissertation on infants' understanding of goal-directed actions was recognized with the prestigious Glasgow Dissertation Prize from the Cognitive Science Society. She then pursued postdoctoral research at MIT with Rebecca Sachs, integrating behavioral experiments with neuroimaging and computational modeling to explore the cognitive and neural foundations of intuitive reasoning. Her pioneering research has shown that even in their first year, infants interpret others' goals and preferences by observing their actions, highlighting early capacities of causal reasoning and social understanding. Dr. Liu combines developmental psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and artificial intelligence methods, including behavioral experiments, computational models, and neuroimaging, to investigate how intuitive physics and intuitive psychology interact to shape early human intelligence. By bridging these diverse methodologies, Dr. Liu's work provides deep insights into the emergence of intelligence in infancy, offering valuable perspective not only for psychology and neuroscience, but also for the recent complex efforts to develop human-like artificial intelligent agents. So let's welcome Dr. Liu.
Thanks so much, Chaim. My microphone currently on? Okay, great. And people can hear me? Yes? Okay. All right, well, thank you for the invitation to be here, and thanks for the lovely day that I've had so far. So I've prepared a brand new talk about, things that I've been thinking about in the last couple years. A lot of the work that I'm presenting is brand new. A lot of it's in progress, and almost none of it is published, so I'm really looking forward to discussion and feedback. And in terms of how I prefer to handle questions, maybe let's do, if you have clarification questions, you can raise your hand and ask, but maybe substantive interpretive questions we can take for the onset. Yeah? Okay. So first, let me tell you a little bit about the lab. So here I'm showing you some of the research themes that we work on, some of the methods that we use to work on those things, and also some of our community values. So most of this talk is going to be about this first theme, representations and computations underlying social cognition as they relate to interactions between domains of cognition. So today we're going to be talking about the interplay between intuitive psychology and intuitive. So anyway, that's my lab. So now the talk. Every day we interact with people and with things, so agents and objects, and we do those things in distinct ways. So we think about people, but not objects, as having mental lives like aspirations or fears or beliefs. We think about people as having living bodies that can grow and hurt and heal, that can cause changes in their own motions, and think about multiple things that they could do and choose one of them. And we also feel obligations towards people that simply we don't extend to objects. So research across the cognitive sciences has suggested that we have distinct representations and computations that we bring to bear for reasoning about agents and objects. And for me, it's useful to think about this knowledge as an intuitive theory about how a particular domain works. So what I'm talking about is the sort of causal knowledge that supports a wide range of behaviors, from explanation, like why did that happen, to counterfactuals, what would have happened, to intervention, so what can I do if I want to make something particular happen. And in general, these two abilities, thinking about minds and thinking about things, have been studied separately as distinct processes, and often actually in direct contrast to each other. So this work has revealed that in the domain of objecthood, from an early age, we represent objects as this inert kind of body that persists in time and space, that are subject to dynamic and mechanical forces and have properties like velocity and mass and support and contact, and that the way that they work, the causal law, is something like approximate Newtonian mechanics. By contrast, from an early age, we think about agents as an animate entity that thinks and acts, that is, has mental states like beliefs, emotions, and desires, plan actions subject to how much they want things and the cost of the actions that are required to get to those things. And then the causal law that unites all of these representations together is something like approximately rational. So this account predicts actually a couple of things. One thing that it predicts is that distinct neural systems might represent the variables in the computations that are relevant to each domain. And that prediction is actually very well supported. So if you look in the cognitive neuroscience literature, you see that reasoning about people or minds and reasoning about things engage distinct cortical regions. So the first set of regions I'll highlight is the so-called theory of mind network, the regions in red, that respond preferentially when people engage with social events of all kinds. So minimal Hyder and Simmel style videos, stories about mental states, even point light figures. So these regions also contain representations of agents' mental states, including their emotions and their beliefs and their knowledge. On the flip side, there are regions in the frontal and parietal cortices that are reliably engaged when people make physical interactions. The same deal with, regardless of whether they're reading stories about mechanical interactions, trying to solve physical problems, or viewing very minimal kind of Hyder and Simmel style stimuli, except now that you make all the agents inanimate. And they also contain information about the relevant variables for an intuitive theory of physics, like a representation of canonical mass and physical stability. So these are good neural candidates for the intuitive theories of psychology and physics that I've told you about. They respond during the relevant tasks, and they contain the relevant representations. Yet another source of evidence is from studies of atypical development. So, many human infants will grow into adults with the minds and brains like the ones I described. But in some cases, you can see that these two domains can vary independently. So one interesting case is Williams syndrome that is characterized by differences or difficulties with spatial reasoning and physical planning, but relatively normal or preserved performance on tests of social cognition. And on the flip side, autism spectrum disorder is associated with differences in mentalizing and social cognition with relatively normal, quote unquote, performance on tests of physical. Now I'll say, both of these conditions are associated with a range of differences. So for example, autism is associated with differences in sensory processing. Williams syndrome is associated with difficulties with executive functions. But the main point here is that you can get this double dissociation where you have relatively normal performance in the other domain, while a striking difference in specifically psychological or physical. So that's cool. These capacities can vary independently across neurodiversity. So what do we make of all of this? So it seems like people use different systems of thought with distinct computational goals, representations, and computations that are implemented in distinct brain regions to reason about minds and objects. So the really strong interpretation of this data is that these two systems of thought present a kind of common sense mind-body problem for our minds and brains. So that is, it might be difficult to look at a person and to simultaneously represent them as both a mind and also a physical body, as a kind of entity that can both change its own motions and be completely inert, so on and so forth. So many people have argued this, including Liz Belke, who's sitting in this room, and people have described this in various ways. So some people have said, this means that these two systems of thought are modular. Other people emphasize their independent function or incommensurability of the representations, or even reciprocal inhibition between these neural systems. So lots of people have made that claim. So to some researchers, looking at a person is kind of like looking at a Necker cube. It's hard to think of them as both a mind and a physical body at the same time. So the implication of that hard problem is that it's hard. It could even require special cognitive tools or resources in order to solve it. And yet it seems like this mind-body problem, if it's hard for philosophy and science, it's not so hard for us. So in this video, this poor dog has gotten themselves stuck in a dam. and the angle of the wall is too steep for the dog to climb up. So someone goes into the water to try to help, but they actually can't get out by themselves either, so they're kind of stuck. So let me see if I can control this by, I have to do this. Yes. I'll fast forward to you. What happens over the course of several minutes is that people are watching and they come up with a creative solution. They form a human chain right to the end, where they form a human chain and they get the dog out, and also they get themselves out, and that they're all very, very good. Here's the final solution after several minutes. Figure this out. Okay, so what does it mean for our minds and brains that we can both plan and understand these actions? Well, here we're definitely reasoning about the psychological world, right? We're thinking about people's goals and their beliefs and the dog's needs and thinking and trying and planning. But those plans depend on representations of people and the dog as physical bodies that are stuck in a physical situation. And even more, there's this idea of obligation and care and collaboration that the people are, working together to solve this problem, and we can appreciate that. So, of course, at some point, the point is that these domains of knowledge have to come together somehow. So that's not necessarily a new claim, but the question is how. So in today's talk, I'm going to ask the question, how do we make sense of other agents simultaneously as physical bodies and ethereal minds? And I'll propose that we do this by dedicating two distinct but integrated systems for reasoning about minds and bodies that are grounded in shared representations of the world. So I'll argue that our minds and brains represent agents as objects and actions as physical events, and that computations about mental states, like agents' intentions and desires, depend on specific physical variables. And I'm going to try hard to tour us through many sources of evidence, ranging from developmental psychology to cognitive neuroscience to machine learning.
You mean physical action? Like if I just give you an instruction.
We're going to talk about that. There's a study about that. Okay, excellent. So first, I need to teach you two classic studies from developmental psychology that I think already show that infants make sense of agents in terms of physical bodies. So here, what you're seeing is a still frame from a study where kids see one agent leap across a barrier in order to get to a goal. And then what you can do is you can show them this over and over again, and then introduce events with two sources of novelty. So in one of these cases, you're keeping the path the same, but now it's inefficient because the barrier is gone. And the other case, it's efficient, it obeys that principle, but it's an entirely new path. So the logic is that if infants respond more to the change in the efficiency of the action than the change of the path, that's one piece of evidence that they could be representing agents as physically constrained and understanding in some sense that they're navigating around obstacles, that the obstacle is the reason for the deviation of the path. So just to quickly tell you what happens, right? Infants come into the lab, they watch these events over and over again until their looking time decreases to some degree. And then what you do is you show them in counterbalanced order 2 test events, and then you measure their looking times again. And these are the sorts of data that you make your inferences over. Okay, so that's one study about efficient rational action. And here's a second one, where the question is, if babies see this event where a hand is reaching for one of 2 objects, the question is, do they interpret that hand as directing the action at the object or wherever the object is, such that if the objects switch locations, they would go to the same place. So you can run the study using exactly the same logic by showing them the hand reaching for the ball again and again and again and again. Then you switch the objects and you ask, well, what is more new to the baby now? A change in the object or the change in the path? So I showed you mock data, right? What do data actually look like from these studies? Well, these are 2 of the most classic tests in the domain of action understanding in infant cognition that have been conducted for many, 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 many years. So here's one way to look at this data. So this is data from a meta-analysis led by my graduate student, Joseph Uta. So here on the y-axis is looking time in seconds. And I'm showing you data on the left of looking to the inefficient and the efficient action and the constraint and the efficiency task, and the reach for the new object or the new path in the goals task, so the same task that I just showed you. And each pair of dots is data from a single experiment, and the size of the dot is the sample size. So in total, we have something like 800 infants. So you can do lots of things here. You can say, okay, let me get an estimate of what the effect size might be. That's neat. We'll come back to this data set later, but one thing you could be wondering is, well, how do we know that the interpretation that I gave, that this is about efficiency and goals, is really the right one? Well, developmental psychologists address this via simple experimental design. So the logic is, if this is really about rational action and not, let's say, the longer path being more interesting to look at no matter what, you can run a simple experiment where you just move the barrier out of the way. And it turns out that that manipulation takes away the effect. And similarly, you can say, well, is this really about a hand with a goal or just some kind of shape that's moving towards another one? And you can do lots of interesting controls, but I really like this one, where instead of the hand grasping the object in an intentional way, the hand is kind of flopping past one of the objects, and then that manipulation also takes the effect away. So it looks like these effects are specific to agents who are acting intentionally, and it also suggests that babies can kind of tell what's happening. So I'll argue that in both of these studies, they already require some composition of physical and psychological information. That is, the efficiency of the action is defined relative to the path, and the goal is defined relative to the object. So these are just two cases. There are many more cases that support this idea. So for example, so I just said this case that objects can serve as the goal of an agent, and also it's an obstacle to another one. And you can also run this interesting test where you can show babies an ambiguous scene, like the one on the left, and they seem to infer that there must be something that the agent is jumping over behind the occluder. You can even run the very simplest case, just testing whether infants think that agents are solid objects, and they think that they are. They look longer when an agent appears to pass through a solid wall. And all of this leads to a prediction, which is if infants are representing agents as objects and actions as physical events, using the same representations that they apply to inanimate objects, that's the claim, that in infancy, variability in action understanding, either across age or across infants, is partially explained by variability in their physical understanding. So that's a prediction. How are we supposed to do that? Well, there's many things that we're trying to do, but let me tell you about one of them. So we look back at these two tasks and we said to ourselves, okay, so they're similar in many, many ways. So they've been studied for 30 years in infants as young as 3 months old. They're studying intentional goal-directed action. So the design is even quite similar. So the two test events contrast looking towards an action with a new path and an action that indicates a new mental state. And even the stimuli are pretty similar. We have one agent who's the actor, one patient, the goal, and then one other object, either the obstacle or the dispreferred object, okay? And, both tasks require infants to reason about intentional action directed towards an object, but by hypothesis, one of them, the constraints task, places a higher demand on infants to conduct a physical analysis of the scene. And if the ability to conduct a physical analysis of the scene is changing or improving over the first year of life, the prediction is that would influence that task more. So here's what we did. We did a meta-analysis where we measured effects from these two classic tasks that I've told you about, as well as a third test of infant physical reasoning. So here, infants are trying to predict whether a car, for example, that rolls down a ramp is going to land before it is going to be stopped by a barrier, or alternative, whether it's possible for it to jump across to the other side, violating solidity. So here's the logic. To the extent that any of these effects are changing with age, that change should be more related in the pair of tasks that share that demand for a physical analysis, that is between the constraints and the task, than the pair that don't share that demand, in spite of the many, many, many similarities between the two tests of action. That's the logic. So we pre-registered that rather risky prediction. So let me show you what we found. So first, I'm just adding a third panel, which is looking at the unexpected and the expected outcome for all three events. So I added violation of solidity in the middle. And I guess I just want to pause here. Most of you probably don't know how slow infant testing is. This data represents thousands and thousands of hours of work over many, 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 many years. And I think it's kind of amazing that we're able to use these data in order to ask a new question. So on the next slide, I'm going to convert these data into effect sizes. So in the next slide, on the y-axis is going to be how much longer infants looked at the unexpected outcome relative to the expected one in standardized units. And I'm also going to show you how it changes with age. So on the next slide, I'll show you age plotted against effect. So here what we're seeing is that responses to inefficient action and violations of validity are increasing with age in a manner that doesn't differ between that pair of tasks. But both of these look strikingly different from this control task that shares many, many, but differs in terms of the demand to apply a physical analysis. So basically, this is exactly what we predicted. If you're surprised, you should have seen me when I saw these results. Really could have been otherwise. I actually didn't even know from the prior literature how these effects were changing with age. But actually, it's very striking that, anyway, I just think it's really interesting. These results are brand new. This is still work in progress. So I'd love to know your feedback. So anyway, what are we trying to say here? We're saying, look, there's a striking similarity in the effect of age on two tasks that require infants to reason about the effect of a physical obstacle on an object's motion and the effect of a physical barrier on an agent's action. And that connection is specific to a test of action understanding that required that physical analysis. And we actually see some similar results in other exploratory analyses on other moderators. And you'll have to stay tuned for more later. So I also kind of wanted to use this opportunity to make a plug for meta-analysis. So in developmental psychology, I see a move to collect more data, richer data, and I'm part of that movement. I worked on methods to help accelerate that kind of work, and I believe in it. But I also think that there's an opportunity here to make more out of the data that we have that have been painstakingly collected. And I think that this method can be a tool not only for summarizing effect sizes or measuring publication bias, but actually a tool for asking new questions and approaching classic questions in new ways. Of course, there's strengths and weaknesses, right? The strength is that you get a much bigger sample size than you otherwise would be able to if you wanted to run a new study. And of course, the weakness is that it's retrospective. Work was already done. There's no sense of random assignment. There are some limitations too. So I'll just throw up a couple of references of papers that use meta-analysis in order to test new research questions in developmental psychology. And also, I'll tell you about some ongoing and future directions that are too new to tell you much about. So another is, instead of looking across the literature and studying group level effects, you could actually test the same baby in all three of these tasks, or a suite of tasks, whatever task you want, and make predictions about patterns of individual differences along the same lines. And you can also think about, you can take babies who maybe are in the middle of acquiring some psychological or some physical expectation, and you could ask whether training infants on a physical event could improve their understanding of action or vice versa. Okay, so that was evidence from infant mind. So now let's go to this side, to the cognitive neuroscience literature, and we're going to look at representations of actions and agents of adult brains. So historically, the field of cognitive neuroscience has approached this question by directly contrasting two or more carefully controlled conditions. So one targeting social processing and the other one targeting physical processing. These are really beautiful experiments. So let me show you one of them. So here's one example of a task developed by Jason Fisher and Nancy Canwisher. So here you're supposed to imagine that you're looking at the simile from above. And if you focus on the one on the left, it kind of looks like there are these two animated agents copying each other. And on the right are very similar events, except the two circles look like they're in animate. So what we can do, you can scan people while they watch these tasks and ask which brain regions respond more to one condition than the other. So I'll show you, this is just a group analysis data I collected during my postdoc. So here we're looking at the left lateral surface of the brain. In this task, actually many regions show preferential response to one of these two conditions. So that's a visual task. So now let me tell you about another example developed by Miriam Hopman and Marina Bedney that contrasts stories about people's false beliefs and stories about outdated representations of physical states. So for example, someone placed her high heel shoes under her dress and went shopping, and someone else borrowed the shoes and put them somewhere else. So that's a story that evokes something like a false belief. And on the right, when a picture was taken of the tower of playing cards, it was nearly 2 feet tall. And then a few hours, the tower collapsed, and that evokes a sense that the picture is an outdated representation of the actual state of the world. So again, you can do the same thing where you can ask which brain regions respond to more than one condition versus the other. And there are lots of differences here, especially if you're not used to looking at brain maps, but also really striking similarities. And these are two of the many, many, many studies that have been conducted like this. So just to summarize vast literature, here are some of the regions that are reliably engaged when people think about other people's minds, social interactions, and objects and physical interactions. So the social regions are in red, and the physical regions are in blue. And what I'll say now is that these studies are set up to test a certain question. So these studies are set up to gather evidence to reveal whether or not there are domain-specific functions, right? So these tasks, these univariate tasks that are contrasting two conditions, are well poised to reveal this kind of domain specificity. And the results are striking. They're not obvious. It didn't have to be this way, right? They've all been one mush. You could have not found anything. So instead, you see these striking and interesting differences. Yet at the same time, these studies are not set up to reveal evidence for shared or interdependent functions. So now I'm going to go through a couple of cases from other people, including in our lab, taking a different approach. So first is a case by Pramod R.T. on physical stability. So here, what he did is he had adults lie in the scanner and look at images of physically stable and unstable situations. So some of these feature just inanimate objects like Jenga towers. Actually, these aren't the stimuli. This is from a figure I made for a paper. But anyway, so it's stable and unstable physical situations, and also physically stable and physically unstable situations featuring people in them. And what he found is that in regions that are associated with physical inference, those regions respond with higher amplitude to physical instability, and they also contain an invariant code that can tell apart physically stable from physically unstable situations, regardless of whether people were in those situations or objects in those situations. So in other words, a neural code for physical stability that generalizes across agents and objects. So next is a case of interactions between people, between objects, and between people and objects. So this is the work of Seda Karakoz Akbiak. So here in this study, adults watched videos and read sentences, including events like hit, pass in front of, and bounce. And the question was, where in the brain is there information about these events, regardless of who is doing the bouncing and who is being bounced, or regardless of the ontological categories of the agent. So I'm going to show you results from a decoding analysis on responses to just the sentence stimuli. And what Seda found is that cortical regions associated with physical and social functions contain an abstract neural code for these events. That is an invariant code for event dynamics that generalizes across objects and agents. And interestingly, she found evidence for these representations in regions that respond preferentially to social and physical events. So next is a case from my lab. So this is led by postdoc Min-Jae Kim. So a few slides ago, I said that the basic understanding that objects and agents are solid and physically constrained is this early emerging, really fundamental intuition that's available to infants. So Min-Jae wanted to know whether the regions that are associated with physical inference also house such representations in the domain in a variant way. So here we took advantage of existing fMRI data that I collected during my postdoc on the tasks that I've already shown you. So here, participants are seeing a bird's eye view of two circles interacting in a 2x2 design. So half the time they act as if they're social agents, half the time they act as though they're billiard balls. Orthogonal to that, half the videos have a barrier in them and half of them don't. So that was one stimulus set. The other task was modeled after videos from developmental psychology. So again, there are social and physical videos, some with barriers, some without. And then even better, some of these stimuli have occluders in them that look similar to barriers, but don't count because they're not causally interacting with the objects or the agents in the scene. So what she wanted to know is which brain regions contain information about barriers to motion and action that generalize across domains and stimuli. We're trying to do really far generalization here. So what she did is she trained a classifier to distinguish between events with and without barriers in one data set. And she asked whether those representations were general enough to classify held out data from the other task and vice versa. Okay. So, and the hypothesis, right, is that despite their preferential responses, for example, to physical stimuli, these domain-specific regions will contain information about barriers to motion and action that generalizes in the ways that we discussed. So here's what we found. We have classification accuracy on the y-axis. Chance is 50%, so there's either a barrier in them or not. And what we found is that regions that responded preferentially to physical events, those in blue, so at least two of them, at least, I guess it's the left and the right superior parietal lobule, robustly encoded information about the presence or the absence of a barrier to motion and action that can even tell apart an occluder from a barrier. And interestingly, we also saw a hint of this in social brain regions like the LTPJ and the precursors. So this goes to Sam's question. Minjae said, that's really, really interesting. But would we also use these frontal parietal regions to reason about people's actions, even if those actions didn't involve physical movement at all? So she did an additional experiment where she wrote lots and lots of stories. So here's one of them. A small rock was lodged in a riverbed. The river current eroded the surrounding area. The rock became free and was carried downstream. That's one story. Here's another one. Sally wanted to start her own biodegradable straw business. Mark told her that this was a dumb idea. Sally did not go through with her business plan. Okay, so these two stories differ in many, many ways. Like the obvious way is that one of them has people in them and the other one has objects in them. But they also differ in one abstract way, which is that in the case on the left, there's one entity that's in some sense enabling another. And on the right, there's one entity that is in some sense preventing. So Minjae wanted to know, is there a common neural code for enabling and preventing that abstracts across domains, even in cases where no one is physically enabling or preventing anyone else, but rather doing things like encouraging them or explaining things to them or dissuading? So we're going to do another classification analysis over these data. So the idea is that you can train a classifier to distinguish between physical enable and prevent, and then test that classifier on held out data that in this case doesn't contain any physical interaction whatsoever, and vice versa. And you can again study the performance in these brain regions that are classically associated with physical and social reasoning that preferentially respond to social events. So what she found is above chance classification in regions associated with physical reasoning, interesting, the very same regions as the other study. And again, to a lesser extent, social reasoning. Now, here, these are the results of a quite small pilot study, and I don't want to make too much of this yet. But if true, the implication would be that even in the absence of physical stimulus or physical content, we think about other people's interactions in physical terms using computations that we also apply to the interactions between inanimate objects. Okay, so to sum up, distinct cortical regions respond during psychological and physical tasks and contain representations that are relevant to each domain. And yet, regions associated with physical reasoning, sometimes also social reasoning, contain representations that are relevant for understanding the actions of agents and the motions of objects that represent things like stability and dynamic constraints. And so the next steps, again, they're too early for me to even tell you much about other than just these bullets, is what we're going to do is take some of the same data and we're going to compare functional connectivity between so-called physical and so-called social brain regions, and we're going to compare them during processing of social versus physical scenes. And the hypothesis, right, is that during social cognition, those brain regions are working together more than during physical cognition. And the other thing is that we have a TMS setup in our department. And what we're going to do is we are eventually going to causally intervene on these brain regions. And the interesting hypothesis is that if you disrupt a region that is associated with physical inference, then it would impair temporarily reasoning about physical things, but perhaps also social interactions. Yeah.
That's a good question. And possible alternative hypothesis to brain regions dedicated to physics that's engaged in physical reasoning about engagement.
Is this a interpretive question?
I suppose, yeah.
I can quickly answer. So I think that depending on who you ask, there's this idea that the lateral path, the dorsal and the ventral stream. So some people think that we have a lateral stream that's specialized for representing the bodies of social agents and encoding the interactions. So that is definitely an alternative hypothesis, right?
So the computational hypothesis, there's some kind of specialized.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. That's implemented in those regions. Right. Okay, so that was about the first dependence. Our minds and brains represent agents as objects, actions as physical events. And what I'll say is that's, not quite theory of mind, right? But it's critical because theory of mind is fundamentally about making sense of people's actions, often physical actions, in terms of their hidden mental states. So now we're going to talk about the second dependence, which is that computations about the mind require physical inference in order to return an answer. And I'll also try to say more about the computational account for all of this. Okay, so here's one case where I think that shows compelling that even babies can compose physical and psychological information for social cognition. So here, this case study is really about the intuition that if you see someone work really hard for something, they must be really motivated. So here, baby saw a central agent try harder to get to one social partner than another. So specifically, suppose that someone jumps a small but not a medium barrier for one agent, and a medium but not a high barrier for another one. And then the question was, which one do they like better? So if you notice, what we're basically doing is combining the methods from the two classic tests of infant cognition in order to ask this question. And what we found is that after seeing an agent try harder for one goal than another, babies looked longer in surprise when the agent chose against that preference at test. In subsequent studies, we asked how broad infants' understanding of action cost is, so whether it's really just something about path length. So we did things like we manipulated action cost in terms of the angle of a ramp or the width of a gap, and we found the same results. So the interpretation is that in all these cases, babies are making some kind of physical judgment and using it to infer a mental state, right? Working from effort to preference. And that's just one case. So that's the case of physical effort. I've also worked on a case of physical danger. So the idea is that falling a greater distance would be worse psychologically and bodily than falling a shorter distance. Another case is the evidence that infants represent accomplishing a goal as good and emotionally rewarding. So they think that it's more likely for an agent to laugh than cry if they successfully get to the thing than if they fail. And also, physical constraints not only intervene on what people can do. You can't walk through a barrier, but they also constrain what people can perceive and know. So in this case, infants treat the choice between these two objects as if the agent was only aware of one of them. So I don't have time to get into it in detail, but these are just some references in case you'd like to learn more. So I think altogether, this shows that infants are conditioning their understanding of other agents' mental states on variables from intuitive physics. So now let's talk about the computational account that explains this literature. So what do these findings imply about the structure and the content of people's intuitive theories of psychology in formal terms? Well, my colleagues in computational cognitive science would give you the following answer. So one way to think about this is that what we do is build a joint model of the physical and psychological world where agents are objects. Their actions and mental states are defined over physical variables. So an action is basically exerting a force on yourself. And what you're doing is thinking that agents plan actions subject to their beliefs and their desires and their costs. Their actions in turn cause changes to the physical states of the world, like if an agent moves an object, for example. And their actions can also cause changes to their own psychological states. So for example, turning the corner and seeing what's on the other side, learning something. So important caveat, independent of the question of whether these models could be learned or expressed in different formats or different terms, the claim is that models that represent and express causal dependencies between psychological and physical variables should provide a good account of what infants can do and also explain neural function in adult brains in cortical regions that are classically associated with theory of mind and physics. So now let me tell you about some of that work. So this team, led by Tianmin Xu, who is my colleague at Johns Hopkins, lucky me, built a benchmark using all the tasks that you've already learned about in this talk. So understanding goal preferences, action efficiency, and inferring unobserved constraints, and inferring preferences from costs. And he built and compared computational models, one composed of a physics engine and a rational planner to reason about the actions of agents, to a graph neural network that is powerful but lacks explicit representations of mental states and physical dynamics. So what he found is that the model on the right, the one with a joint theory of psychology and physics, performed much, much better And in particular, in this test of generalization, where the model is trained on one scenario and tested on the others, this is a striking case where explicit representation of physical states, physical dynamics, and mental states seem to be important. Plausibly, maybe, because the causal and abstract representations that are important for performance are difficult to learn from scratch. So that was accounting for infant behavior. So what about adult brains? So in other work led by graduate student Manasi Malik in collaboration with Tianmin Xu and Leila Isik, and also me, what we're doing is we're taking another benchmark, this time on social interaction perception. So this is called the phase benchmark. So in this video, and in many videos in this data set, two agents are interacting, and they're either helping each other, hindering each other, or each kind of doing their own thing, pursuing their own goal. And this is a adversarial case where the little green guy is getting in the red guy's way. So what we're doing is measuring and combining and relating data from adult behavioral judgments, neural responses as people are viewing these videos in the scanner, and computational models of as alternative hypotheses how our mind is solving this. So it's an absolutely heroic effort. And the two models she's studying, so on the bottom is, actually they're very similar to the ones from Tianmin Xu's prior paper, right? On the bottom is an generative inverse planning model that passed the infant benchmark. And the alternative is a graph neural network without any explicit representations about physical dynamics or mental states that works from relational visual information extracted from the stimulus. And what's actually interesting here is that in past work, Manasi and Leila found that both models account for people's judgments. And they're also not redundant. So it looks like there's something about when people are watching these videos that in some sense, they are both modeling people as minds acting in a physical world, and they are also quickly extracting visual relational information and then using that to make a judgment in a more computationally way. So what we think is happening is that each of these models are capturing something unique and non-redundant about these behaviors. But here we're using representational similarity analysis, or RSA, to study the neural responses that are aligned to the representations of each. So one hypothesis we're working with is that the same regions we've been talking about all along implement a joint theory of psychology and physics, and these are the ones that might be embodied by models of generative inverse. So this is very much work in progress, but so far that's exactly what we're finding. I'll just show you one result. So here are the places where the representational geometry of the generative inverse planning model aligns with the representational geometry of neural responses after controlling for the contribution of the graph neural network. So stay tuned, and you can ask Manasi more about this at CCN 2025. So that was a whirlwind, but to review, our minds and brains represent minds and objects as ontologically distinct entities, and yet we represent and reason about agents as objects with minds that are planning actions in a physical world. And the most promising, for now, current computational models of these capacities are ones that explicitly model the causal dependencies between variables in these two domains. So, that's one answer, and we'll continue to see where the evidence goes. This is a great time to be working in this field because there's a lot of big, important open questions. There's a lot left to learn. And this is the kind of question that's awesome to work on because it's possible for people from lots of different disciplines in order to come together and put their heads together to figure things out. Okay, so I have a postscript. Do I have time? I think yes, right? Okay, great. So this postscript is on physics, psychology, and biology. So in the list that I showed you at the beginning, people are different from objects in that they have minds, yes, but they are also living bodies that are subject to processes like growth and death and illness and things like that. And in parallel to the cases that I've been telling you in this talk, there's a history of studying these as three different domains that enable three different controls of other people, as mental beings, as physical actors, and as biological systems. And in very, very new work from my lab, we've been starting to think about how all of these domains might all be related to each other or not. So I'll show you a couple cases. So this is, again, work from my graduate student, Joseph Uta. So he's been asking adults to consider events about the mind and the body from prior literature. So for example, here's a pair of two psychological events, seeing something and choosing what to do. And he's asking people two kinds of questions. So one that captures whether people think that these two events are captured by the same latent cause and whether they're directly causally connected to each other. So he doesn't quite ask it this way, but I'm going to simplify for these purposes. But when you ask adults about events like this, they will say, yep, those are caused by the same factor. They'll put them very, very close in a free sort task. And they also think that they're directly causally connected. So they'll say, yeah, seeing something can cause someone to choose what to do. And also choosing what to do can cause you to see something, sure. So there's also cases. So here's a pair from biology, getting sick and becoming hungry, where people say, yeah, those are conceptually related, caused by the same factor, but they don't say that they're directly causally connected. So they tend to say, no, I don't know if like getting sick can directly cause you to become hungry. And I don't know if really becoming hungry can really cause you to get ill. And then, of course, you can ask about this combination. And here people are saying, no, I don't think seeing something and becoming hungry are caused by the same latent factor. And yet they're directly causally related, such that if you wanted to intervene and try to make someone become hungry, one thing you could do is show them a picture of food. Okay, so Joseph will be presenting this at CogSci later, and you can also come up and ask me about it. There's basically too many experiments for me to do it justice, but our working hypothesis is that these two could be two distinct causal frameworks that support social cognition, and properly causal ones too, that would support explanation, counterfactuals, and intervention that would relate representations within and across domains. Okay, so here's the last result. So this is work by my newest graduate student, Amber Liu, and she's interested in how bodily states and psychological states interact. So specifically, she's interested in this concept of energy, and the intuition is that when an agent is exhausted and depleted, that raises the subjective cost of even otherwise very, very, very easy things. So she tested whether adults understand the subjective difficulty of activities depend crucially on the agent's energy state. So she ran this experiment where she said, suppose that an agent is full of energy, how difficult would a range of activities be for them? People say, yeah, I don't know, they're pretty easy. There's a range here. By contrast, when they're told that the agent is completely depleted, they're saying, well, everything now is becoming extremely difficult. And actually, what's interesting about these results is that in this experiment, the effect of energy, which is the main manipulation, is completely swamping the effect of the objective cost of the actions that's rated by a separate group of participants. So people are saying things like, the difficulty of an easy action when you're completely depleted can be harder than the difficulty of a really hard action when you're full of energy. So to close, I'll say that these questions about the interactions between domains of cognition, I think, are extremely interesting. And I guess I'll just end by saying that in order to explain and reverse engineer human intelligence, to plan and understand everyday scenes like this one, we don't only need to account for, to study the representations and computations that are in each of these domains, but also to how they connect together. Okay, so that's it. Thank you to my collaborators in the lab and to funders, and I'll look forward to discussion. Thanks so much. A little minute to think. Yes, hello.
Hi. Beautiful talk. Super exciting to hear all the new stuff we're working on. I have kind of a silly question, which is, are there individual differences in terms of, because every time somebody shows the balls that are supposed to be objects, they see them as agents. And I was wondering if there's individual differences in terms of how people interpret those, and if you could capitalize on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I haven't thought about the second question, which is how to capitalize on individual differences of that kind. But I think Emily Finn is one. Or I can't remember if the stimuli are like this, but I think they might be. So in ambiguous stimuli, what is it possible to both characterize the experimenter imposed labels?
Right.
Like, what do you see when you say social versus physical as determined by the experimenter? And then you can also say, you can ask the people, and some of the people vary in their differences in their interpretations, and say, okay, what can we predict given the participant given labels?
Yeah.
And definitely the answer is that both analyses work just fine. I can't really remember what the upshot of all of this is, but I guess like to connect to your point, what she thinks is that a lot of times we are relying a lot on experimenter imposed labels and less on the interpretations that can vary across individuals.
Yeah, I guess I was connecting it to the ideas that you have to study with individual differences with infants. Like it feels like maybe, even though obviously we expect adults to have relatively similar abilities to do these things, you might be able to manipulate how they're interpreting it, and I don't know, basically testing the same stimulus to see if you get differences across those brain regions, whether they're interpreting it as social or.
Yeah, like the very same contrast where if you make it ambiguous enough, I would see this one as social and you see this one as physical.
Right.
Sorry, I would see this one as social and this one as physical. You would see the opposite and we do the contrast. I think that's what Emily Finn did, and she can recover the same difference. I have to think about the question of, you know, ambiguous perception and how it relates. I think that's really.
Beautiful talk, beautiful experiments. But I found myself asking myself a question actually with each one of the really compelling examples that you give.
Yeah.
And it has to do with the time course of representations of a person as a physical body on the one hand, as a mind on the opposite extreme, and maybe as an actor somewhere in the middle between those things. And I could imagine two very different ways of thinking about this. One would be that at different points in time, maybe first off, you do a pass at analyzing the physics of the situation and you decide this guy is trying to do something physically unfruitful, okay? And then at a second pass, you do some action understanding and clearly he's motivated to engage in this effort, and finally maybe a social analysis of why would he be motivated to engage in this effort. There's another guy at the end of the path that he's taking, right? So that would be one way of that might account for what's going on in our minds or in infants' mind when they look at some of the events that you see. That way of capturing it seems to me altogether neutral on the question, are these separate systems or are they connected systems? If you have some domain general representational system in which you can kind of record the results of analyses of many different aspects of a single scene, right? On the other hand, if you, is there, or another way of putting my question is, do you think there's anything in your data that argues against that view and in favor of a view that says, no, at one and the same moment in time, we don't have a mind-body problem. We can see someone as a body and as a mind at the very same moment in time and operate on a unitary representation of that state.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I feel like fMRI is terrible to ask this question. But let me say one thing, which is on the story that you are passing through, you are representing the scene in different sweeps, and each time applying one sort of analysis, recording the results, and doing the other one. I mean, I feel like, I'm not sure, but I think it makes a prediction about which brain regions represent that information. So it feels to me like if that were true, then one thing you could think is, well, it's what the so-called multiple demand network, the network that is engaged when you are applying mental effort, doing anything difficult in any domain, whether it's a motor task or a visual task, auditory task, and so on and so forth. Not that workspace or whatever that domain general resource is, you know, is housed in those domain specific systems. And to me, it feels like, well, it depends on whether you grant that. If you grant that, then it seems like the data is not right. It seems like that the representations that generalize across the two different cases are housed in the domain-specific systems themselves. However, when I'm thinking about it, I'm being less convinced of my own answer. And we've thought about doing things like, I think there are like interesting psychophysics or basic behavioral experiments that could even be done with adults. So you can compare like the speed with which you would do a purely physical thing, a purely social thing, and a thing that by hypothesis requires an integration. And I think that I would have to predict, do I predict? I think I do predict that integration happens as quickly. So you'd be as fast in the third case than the two other ones. And then I feel like MEG data is probably the other source of evidence that could be good for that. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's an interesting.
Yeah. I agree. Let's do Sam and then.
I just wanted to follow up on this. I actually think that if you really dissect what this would entail, it's not clear that you could really have these multiple passes happening. Like take the example of one object that's pushing another object, right? But what you don't actually see one object pushing another object. You see two objects in motion, right? And it's actually ambiguous whether how much force one object is exerting on the other, right? That's something that you actually have to infer from your sensory data. And part of the way we resolve those ambiguities, at least when we're reasoning about agents, is that we think about which direction does this agent want to go, and that's going to determine how much force they apply, and in what direction they apply it, right?
Yeah, another way to say what you're saying, I took this slide out, but I think that in order to have some account like that, where you're doing like one domain-specific computation at a time, I think it's almost like you'd have to relegate even the very basic functions of action understanding or theory of mind to domain general processing. So if you need domain general processing, even to assign an object to the goal of an agent's action, or to save a physical variable so that you can then make a mental inference from it, it seems like that would push you to say there might not be like an agency system, there's just some kind of social analysis system that, yeah, it's almost, that can't do any of the things that we think it can do without I think that might, yeah.
I mean, there is something special about reasoning about agents, and
Yep.
you want something that's domain specific,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
When you're reasoning about these physical displays, it's impossible to apply that system in isolation. It needs input from a physical system, right? And those
Yes,
things
that's
are kind of talking to each other concurrently.
That's what I think, but I think that there is definitely, there's some like prediction about the timing that I think would really push on this idea, and that would like, it'd be good because I think I'd have to be forced to predict one thing, and I could be wrong about that, which is cool. Maybe.
Talking about timing, I was actually thinking about it too, or about the role of adaptation between these two systems. We can like induce new information. For example, if you showed the two balls that seemed like an agent, when you flash that they're connected by a spring, what's the belief update if you like have new information that changes the paradigm that maybe it's not an agent, it's just a spring system. I mean, and also with agents, for example, like if a car is following another car along, one might think, oh, this person is like following this person around. If I go on the side and I see that they're actually connected by a rope, that would imply that one car is being towed by the other, but it's not actually following. If there's like a bistable perception shift between these two that happens, and maybe there are like neural conditions or people who are certain neural types, you can like really focus on one thing for so long, and they exhaust those resources and they start focusing on the other.
Yeah, certainly my account doesn't predict that you wouldn't be able to have such bistable structures like that. And I, under my account, I predict that you'd still be able to get like that. Like I thought that so-and-so was following someone, but it wasn't true. There was some other physical cause to explain it. Or I thought that there was a physical cause, but actually I was wrong. Someone's following someone. I think that's totally true. And yeah.
You characterize agent as like goals. But what about
Yeah. So independent of whether we actually have free will, certainly we think we do. And I think that infants think that they and others do too. So, I mean, this is connected to many, many ideas, but the idea of there are two things I could have done, and I did one of them. Like that basic understanding, there are multiple action plans that an agent can take, and that they're going to choose one of them and then enact that one and choose against the others. Like, I think that's definitely that's like a fundamental thing to me. And if that's true, then it introduces all sorts of interesting things like opportunity costs. You can't do everything at once. So if you do one thing, that prevents you from doing the other thing. So you better choose well. So I think that you're right that one way to talk about these findings is that babies think that agents have very, very, very good. Thank you.
Question about iterative.
Yeah.
Are you all doing any within participants,
Yeah.
or are you doing it over the whole? Because it kind of looked like the region that you, the physical region.
Yep.
Mental.
Yep.
Also the most.
Yeah. So it depends on which analysis you're talking about, but all the analyses that are done with me as a collaborator on them have functionally defined ROIs. I think the last result from Monasti was a searchlight analysis where you just move a sphere everywhere in the brain and you say, okay, where's the representation alignment and where is there? And I think that's really important for a couple reasons. One of them is, I didn't have time to talk about this, but there's actually a challenge of making references in activity in frontal parietal regions, because those regions are very nearby. And depending on who you ask, they're the same ones or just different ones from the multiple demand network. That is the regions that we use when we apply mental effort and do anything hard for students. So for those reasons, it's really, really important to properly characterize the functions of the regions that you're studying, especially for the physics regions. And in fact, actually for some of the TMS studies that we've been planning, we've worried about this. Like, what if it's the case that the very same set of voxels that one uses when you're reasoning about the actions of objects are also used when you're doing some kind of working memory thing. And then if you zap that part, that would also predict that you would fall apart in social and physical reasoning. So I think for that reason, functionally localizing ROIs is particularly important. And yes, yes. Yes.
Very nice talk. On the first part of that analysis.
Yeah, yeah. Yep.
Also like sense talks, like even for public dynamics,
Yeah.
in a sense, like you need to learn the physics, understand what is taught. First physical rules.
It's a really, really interesting question. I think that if you think about intuitive physics as like the fundamental thing that intuitive psychology relies on, you would predict that. I also feel like there's a case for an alternative, which is not an alternative interpretation, but just like a different way of thinking about it, which is when you're a baby, a lot of the input that you're getting that's relevant for physical learning is coming from people acting on the world. So I actually don't quite know how to answer this question for that reason. Like, I think that it is true that when you're looking at agents, you are likely applying a physical analysis, then predict this like sequence. And yet also, if you're very early on already applying a physical analysis to agents, then it could also be right that there are some physical intuitions that might be hard to learn, but observing someone act on the world gives you really compelling evidence for that. Yeah. So we've been thinking about different ways of doing it. It's training studies. I mean, everything's hard, but training studies are really, really hard. But yeah.
Okay,
Thanks, everybody.